off and about. Well, we're continuing our study through Genesis, looking for traits and characteristics of God. And I hope it's okay. We're going to start at the end of my sermon, because I rewrote this one, because I finished it and I didn't like it. And Shauna came home yesterday and she said, well, how much did you get done? And I said, 5 pages. And then I started over. But I liked the end, so I kept it. It's a parable of Jesus from Luke 18. He said, in a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about men. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care about men, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually wear me out with her coming. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Now, if we just read that parable, I'm a little confused. Am I supposed to think in some sense that God is like the unjust judge? I don't think that's right. That doesn't work, does it, Steve? Doesn't sound right. And yet, we're blessed to have Luke interpret the story for us before he told us the story. I just skipped that verse. But we can do a pop quiz. Does anybody know what this parable is about according to Luke? All right, I'll tell you the answer. Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. That we are called, commanded, to continue to cry out to God in prayer again and again and not give up. And that's an interesting thought, because there's this moment that I want us to look at in Genesis. And it's a difficult text to preach. But I hold on to this moment in Luke 18 to help me understand what's happening. You see, I know that God is not an unjust judge. I know that, in fact, what he is the just, righteous, perfect judge. And so I hold on to that while I turn to Genesis chapter 18. Now, before we look at Genesis chapter 18, I want to ask, did you guys learn about like Greek gods and Roman gods and Norse mythology and all that when you were a kid? Did anybody learn about that? You did? Okay, I'm not alone. I remember learning about them in school, and I remember specifically how they interacted with humans. And the thing that always stood out to me was it didn't really ever seem to go so well for the humans. That these gods, these powerful beings, seem to treat these human beings as almost playthings, and setting up scenarios and tests and things and combat and gambling amongst the other gods and all sorts of confusion and stuff. And they would just seem to participate in these activities that cared so little for the human beings that were crying out. And while there is this next part of this text in Genesis 18 that seems a little bit like that, it is completely different. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's recorded for us. Because the Yahweh, the great I am, is not like those gods. Not even close. And the circumstances in which he engages in Genesis 18 are very different. God intends to deal with the sin that is present in Sodom and Gomorrah. But before he does, he tells Abraham. Now you think of that. The text tells us that God doesn't intend to hide anything from Abraham. And so he speaks to him and tells him about Sodom and Gomorrah and his judgment against them. And then something very unique happens that is completely unlike any of those other stories I learned when I was a kid. Then Abraham approached him and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it for you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it for you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" The Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke up again, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? If I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again he spoke to him, "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?" He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?" He said, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" He answered, "For the sake of the 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. Now, here's what's amazing about this text to me. It would seem that God is willing to allow his relationship with Abraham to place limits on his activities. Now, I know we tend to get lost in the Sodom and Gomorrah side. But do you see what's transpiring here? God, an all-powerful creator who is willing to act or not act based on the desires of his people. That is an amazing thing. I know that God will not find anyone righteous in the city. I already know that story. But it's this moment, this give and take with Abraham, that really grabs my attention. Let alone, if I were God, Abraham, just get to the point. What do you want? And God, an infinitely patient God, continues to listen to requests that sound more like my 3-year-old asking me for a cookie than they do a man of faith standing in the presence of God. And that picture is remarkable. And he will find no one righteous in the city. But he tells Abraham what is happening, knowing Abraham will struggle with it, the same way I do when I read the story. God speaks to Abraham knowing he's going to struggle. Why? Why does God care? He knows that the people in the city don't seek justice, and God seeks justice. And I know that God is a just judge. But he does not act in the capricious manner like those other gods in those other stories that I learned when I was a kid. He doesn't act that way. The story of Genesis reveals something else about the nature of God as well, and the relationship he shares with us. The city will be destroyed because God does not find anyone righteous in it. In fact, I've never felt really good about the whole Lot family being rescued from the city. It's because the story of Lot is not a good one when I read it. It's always made more sense to me that the blessings of Abraham are somehow spilling over onto Lot, more so than Lot is somehow being blessed directly by God because he's somehow righteous. And that's exactly what the text leading up to this moment shows us. Lot being blessed because he's traveling with Abraham, and Lot being blessed in this moment in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the text tells us, early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Lot is rescued because of God's promise to Abraham, not because Lot is righteous. It was his love and devotion to Abraham that caused Lot to be saved. And that kind of God, one driven by love, is the God that we need. And he is very different from the gods who showed up in those other stories. And I may not understand the justice of God. I struggle with it. Why does he spare some and punish others? I don't understand. But I do understand one thing that the story shows me. Love is a relationship. It's a give and a take. It's blessings exchanged back and forth. Love is a relationship, and we are the recipients of God's love. And when we respond to the love of God, seeking relationship with him, he willingly enters into sort of a partnership with us. I like the New Testament-y word better, a fellowship with us. An all-powerful creator in love with his creatures in such a way that he treats us not as creatures, but as friends. Isn't that a remarkable thing? And it's so clearly seen in Jesus, so perfectly captured as he spends years upon the earth extending friendship, fellowship to people who certainly don't deserve it. And we see these pictures of Jesus in fellowship, meals gathered with people who are notorious sinners. Well, of course, the notorious sinners. What other kind of people would Jesus find? but he's gathered at a meal with notorious sinners. I said we were headed to the beginning of my sermon. Genesis chapter 18 begins, and Abraham sees 3 men in the distance, and he races out and invites them to enjoy fellowship with him, to have a meal. And it turns out this is indeed a special guest. It's the Lord himself who comes over to have dinner with Abraham. And we tend to focus on the moments in the story where God is having a meal with Abraham and Sarah. And it's at that meal that God says, I'm going to give Sarah a son. In her old age, she'll have a child. And Sarah, probably on the outside of the tent, on the other side of the curtain, laughs. Boy, it's a good thing God is the God we need and not the one we deserve. God makes a promise, and Sarah laughs. God is ridiculous. His promises are foolish. That will never happen. And then God says, why did you laugh? And Sarah, oh so perfectly representing us, I didn't laugh. Try telling an all-knowing God what he knows. Have you tried that? Yeah. And Sarah ends up talking with the God that she needs, not the one she deserves. And God simply says, you did laugh. And Sarah ends up bearing a son whose name is Laughter. Because God engages with his creation as the God that we need, not the one we deserve. And perhaps that's one of the things that Jesus is trying to get us to understand with this story of the unjust judge. You see, God is so different from the other kinds of gods that people serve. He does not hurl lightning bolts. I've never found that story. I'm sometimes flippant. I apologize. I work so hard on trying to keep my tongue. I don't always do it. I had somebody I was having a conversation with, and they said, may God not strike me. And I said, that's a different God. You see, the world around us believes in the stories, and they've been polluted. The world has been polluted with images of God that are not God. They'll even try to do it with this story in Genesis 18 and 19. But that's not the God that's in these pages. He's not that kind of God. In fact, he's exactly the opposite. He's a God who is just, whose actions are right. And it's an amazing picture of a God who's willing to limit himself so that he can be in partnership with you. We're the limiting factor. Which is why Jesus says, I think at the end of the parable, but when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Faith is what allows us to make up the difference between what we believe can happen, what we expect to happen, and what God can do. And Sarah laughed because her faith wasn't found. And I need to ask you to pause this morning and look at the character of God seen in this story and ask yourself, what limits are you placing on God? What are you telling him that he can't do? Because I need you to pause and recognize that God is probably saying, well, okay, Art, if that's the limit you want to put on me, I guess we won't do that today. Will he find faith to believe that there is something more that can happen? You see, God would rather partner with you. God would rather partner with you than dominate you. God would rather partner with you than control you. God would rather partner with you than punish you. And I think we've discovered the crux of our problem. We are unwilling to partner with God. And so we do not enjoy the blessings of fellowship. You see, God is not the God that my world thinks he is. He is not unfair. He is not capricious. He is loving, and he is patient. He wants no one to suffer, no one to perish. And that is why Jesus came, to join us for dinner, to laugh with us, to cry with us, and to ultimately bless us, because the blessings come from his side. Our side, all we know is need. And God is willing to partner with us to bring us exactly what we need. Imagine it. A God who loves you just the way you are and wants to share a meal with you, who is willing to listen to your heart's desires, who is even willing to let you keep bending his ear because you don't feel like it's going the way you think it should. He's willing to let you ask again and again and again and again and again and again because he loves you. And he is a just God. And he wants you to keep asking, because Jesus is the revelation of God. He is exactly the God that is. One who partners with us and does not condemn us. And I want to end with this text from Ephesians. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sin, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit, who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our sinful nature and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature objects of wrath, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. He's been the same all along. The same God. And we are so blessed to be able to call out to Jesus, the revelation of God, to join him, to partner with Christ, to accept, to participate in his death, his burial, and his resurrection through baptism, to be able to join God. If you've never claimed Jesus, today is an opportunity to do that. And if you're a believer and you're struggling and what you need is the church to gather around you and to call out to the just God that we serve, to ask again, we want to do that. Whatever your need is, would you please come forward as we stand together and sing?